And now for the anatomy of the female reproductive system. Again, more complicated than the male system. The female reproductive anatomy essentially has to do more than the male system. The male system is pretty much just geared towards making sperm and getting it out of the male body, whereas the female system not only makes the sex cells and the sex hormones, but it also does all of the gestation and parturition processes as well. And then, of course, nourishes the newborn infant through the mammary glands. So a little bit more complicated here. But still some kind of similarities between the female anatomy and the male anatomy, in that the ovaries are the primary sex organ for the female system. This is what actually produces the ova or the eggs, and then is responsible for secreting our two sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. There is an ovarian artery that branches off the abdominal aorta that brings blood to the ovaries, and then also an ovarian vein that drains them back into the vena cava. The ovaries themselves are kind of held in place by a whole bunch of ligaments. The ovarian ligament holds the ovaries in place in terms of their alignment with the uterus. There's a whole series of ligaments that kind of collectively get referred to as the broad ligament that hold the ovaries in place in terms of their relationship to the lateral walls of the pelvis, and then a suspensory ligament holds the ovaries in place in relation to the posterior pelvic wall. Let me point that out for a second. So you can see here is the ovary. It's this kind of roughly almond-shaped organ. You can see it's connected via this ovarian ligament to the uterus, this suspensory ligament to the back of the pelvis, and then the broad ligament is this structure here, which connects not only the ovary via the mesopelnix and the mesovarium, but also the uterus and the cervix via the mesometrium part of this broad ligament. So whilst the suspensory ligament and the ovarian ligament look more like we typically expect ligaments to look like, kind of fibrous in nature, the broad ligament is more like an aponeurosis. It's kind of like a sheet of connective tissue that helps anchor not only the ovary itself, but also the uterus and the cervix. So the ovaries are covered in a little connective tissue capsule called the tunica albuginea. And then, like many of the organs that we've looked at, the ovaries have an outer cortex and then a more inner medulla. The cortex is where the gametes are developing, the eggs are developing inside these little structures, these little sacs called follicles. And then the medulla is more where we find some of the nerves and blood vessels that are coming out to the ovaries. Inside the cortex of the ovaries are what are known as ovarian follicles, essentially these kind of little sac-like structures that contain an oocyte, which is an immature egg, and that egg then gets encased in kind of different numbers of layers, and kind of we're going to talk about follicle development when we get to female physiology, but the number of layers and the types of cells that surround the oocyte changes during the monthly cycle, and changes as the follicle develops. But essentially every month, one of these oocytes will be essentially ejected from a follicle that has fully ripened. So it gets spit out of the oocyte. The oocyte gets kind of like spit out of the ovary. And that is ovulation, which occurs monthly. The duct system of the female system, unlike with the male system, has no direct contact with the ovaries. So in the male system, the epididymis was directly connected to the reedy testes through the efferent ductules. But in the female system, the duct system actually doesn't directly come in contact. It's not kind of directly connected to the ovaries. And in fact, sometimes when an oocyte erupts, when an oocyte ovulates, it actually just gets spit into the abdominal cavity and doesn't get picked up by the duct system, and so never actually makes it into the uterine tubes. In terms of the duct system, the first part of this is the uterine tubes. Sometimes they're referred to as oviducts or fallopian tubes. That's what's actually going to move these oocytes. The uterus is then what kind of grabs onto and nourishes the ovum once it has been fertilized, and then the vagina serves as the birth canal, the passageway for the menstrual flow, as well as serving as the copulatory organ for the female reproductive system. So let's talk about the uterine tubes. There are 3 regions to the uterine tube. The first portion is this kind of funnel-shaped portion called the infundibulum, and it has these little finger-like projections that are ciliated that are called fimbriae that kind of drape over the ovary. Not, again, kind of directly connected, right? The oocyte's still going to get released into the abdominal cavity, pelvic cavity, and essentially what has to happen is the little fimbriae, they kind of sweep across the surface of the ovary and kind of grab onto the oocyte, and then bring it into the majority kind of rest of the way of the uterine tube, which is the ampulla, which is where fertilization usually occurs, and then the last part of the uterine tube is known as the isthmus, which essentially empties then into the uterus. The oocyte is carried along the uterine tubes by some smooth muscle action, so a little peristalsis, little cilia. The cells lining the uterine tubes are ciliated, kind of keeping like a little conveyor belt, moving the oocyte through the oviduct. There are some non-ciliated cells that help nourish and sustain the oocyte as well as the sperm, because when a sperm comes in through the vagina, because the vagina is the copulatory organ, so the sperm have to swim through the vagina, through the cervix, through the whole of the uterus, and then finally into the uterine tube in order to actually connect to the oocyte and fertilize the oocyte. So the uterus is a hollow organ, very, very thick-walled, very, 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 very muscular. The first portion is this rounded portion of the uterus. This is known as the fundus. The rest of this kind of triangular shaped part is the body of the uterus, and then finally narrowing into the isthmus, and then ultimately into the cervical canal of the cervix, and then eventually into the vagina. There are some cervical glands here in the cervix that create a kind of mucousy plug that blocks the sperm, except during kind of a mid-cycle process. The uterus itself is, again, like the ovary, kind of held in place. The broad ligaments help anchor it to the lateral walls of the pelvis. The round ligaments anchor it to the anterior part of the pelvis, and then there are uterosacral ligaments that connect the uterus to the sacrum. And then there's also what we call lateral cervical ligaments or cardinal ligaments that help connect the cervix to the lateral walls of the pelvis. The uterus itself has 3 layers in its wall. The outer layer is known as the perimetrium. It's essentially visceral peritoneum, right? It's kind of the serous layer. Then the kind of bulk of it is then the myometrium, right? Myo meaning muscle. And so we are talking about the layer of smooth muscle that is responsible for contractions during childbirth. And then all the action of the uterus occurs in what is known as the endometrium, which is the mucosa of the uterus. And it is this endometrium that the fertilized egg will actually kind of burrow into and remain there during the whole shebang. So here in this diagram, you can see the mucosal layers here, as well as a little bit of this very kind of surface layer of the myometrium. Now, the endometrium has 2 layers, strata. There is the upper layer, which is the functional layer of the uterus, the stratum functionalis. And this is the part that thickens and changes according to the hormonal cycle monthly. And it's also the portion of the endometrium that is shed during menstruation. The lower layer of the endometrium is known as the stratum basalis, or the basal layer, and it is responsible then for forming a new stratum functionalis after kind of the unused one has been shed during menstruation. And unlike the functional layer of the endometrium, the basal layer is unresponsive to the ovarian hormones, so it doesn't change cyclically like the functional layer of the endometrium does. This shedding of the endometrium is large part driven by hormonal changes, but particularly the way the vascular system is set up in the endometrium. So here you can see the uterine artery, again branching off of the abdominal aorta. They then branch into these arcuate arteries in the myometrium of the uterus, and then branching off the myometrium of the uterus are these radial arteries. And then these radial arteries in the kind of somewhat lower layers of the endometrium then break into these straight arteries here in the basal layer, and these don't regenerate, but then all these little kinky spiral arteries out in the functional layer. And the spiral arteries in the functional layer essentially degenerate and regenerate and degenerate and regenerate. And the spasms there of that degeneration, regeneration is what causes the functional layer to essentially detach from the basal layer and to be shed as menses during menstruation. In addition to the abdominal organs of the female system, we also do have the mammary glands. Now, these are present in males and females, but they typically only function in females, although sometimes occasionally you get some sympathetic lactation in men. Of course, the production, the purpose of our mammary glands is milk production, so that the newborn can be nourished. The mammary glands are actually not so they're technically part of the reproductive system, but they're really actually just a modified sweat gland. They consist of typically about 15 to 25 lobes. You can see here's a lobe here, and then each lobe is then kind of further kind of subdivided into these little lobules, and the lobules then contain alveoli that actually produce milk. Those are the secretory cells. From the alveoli, the milk travels through these lactiferous ducts and then into these lactiferous sinuses that then open outside at the nipple. Now, typically in a non-nursing woman, all of these kind of glandular parts of the breast are very underdeveloped. And then when a woman begins to nurse, she gets prolactin and from the pituitary, and that develops all of this glandular structure in the alveoli start to produce milk, and then with some oxytocin, the milk can then be released to the infant. The areola is that colored area around the nipple, and then there are typically some suspensory ligaments that help anchor the breast to the underlying muscle tissue, and typically the size of a woman's breast is due to the amount of fat in the breast. So most of the rest of the breast tissue outside of the lobes with the glandular tissue is adipose tissue. And very often when women gain weight, they will gain weight here in their adipose tissue in the breast, and the breasts will get bigger. We also see women who are nursing their breasts get bigger too, but that's not due to the fat deposits, but to that developing and ramping up of the glandular tissue. So if we look at the female anatomy, kind of in toto outside of the mammary glands, you can see here's your ovary. You can see the little fimbriae here on the oviduct that have to kind of catch the oocyte from the ovary. Then we are on into the uterine tubes, which will then connect to the, you can see, uterus here, and then ultimately into the vagina, and then on into some external genitalia. I also want to point out, you can see here's the round ligament, which is connecting the uterus to the anterior wall, the uterosacral ligament that's connecting us posteriorly, and then here is that suspensory ligament helping attach the ovary there to the lateral walls. And that is female anatomy.